Welcome back. In a previous episode, we discussed the 2016 survey of Muslims in Canada. Let's get more in depth to understand some of the findings. For example, if young Muslims feel that they're being discriminated against, then why are they becoming more religious? To answer these questions, we have with us Mohamed Huque, President of the Tessellate Institute, and Shazlin Rahman, Communications Coordinator for Inspirit Foundation. Shazlin, Mohamed, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
So, we talked about the 2016 survey of Canadian Muslims on our show previously, and maybe just comment a little bit about, what brought you guys here, because I'm sure you know that we've covered the segment before.
This project began back in 2013, and for the first 2.5 years of that time was largely spent on fundraising, trying to get the funding for this survey to launch it. And I think the real difficulty was for us to be able to communicate to both within the Muslim community about the effectiveness or why this kind of study or research is valuable. I think our community lacks sort of that level of recognition that beyond mosques and Islamic centers, that there is a vital need for this kind of academic research, public opinion research, and also to the larger point about the value of this kind of research to begin with. So I think social research, public opinion polling like this provides a valuable sort of two-way mirror. So for majority and minority populations within the country to be able to better understand each other, to better understand themselves even. Opinion polls often provide a nuanced description of a community. It's a way in which individuals can be given a voice rather than groups that represent those individuals.
And you think this survey had a good way of doing that?
I think it was certainly a step in the right direction, and it's part of that aim was certainly to be able to capture that opinion, right? And it's a wide-ranging opinion. We're a wide-ranging community, but I'm hoping that it served one part of that.
Shazlin, anything to add?
So about 2 years ago, when Inspirit was in the process of shaping our strategic direction for the next 5 years, we commissioned a study called The Faces of Canada that we've been using internally that helped us identify 2 key issues. One of them was reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and Islamophobia. So we identified those 2 key issues that we needed to focus as an organization. That's why we decided to support the study of Muslims in Canada with Environics and Tessellate Institute. And furthermore, because our mandate is around young people between 18 and 34 years old, we decided to commission an additional study that should be read as a companion to the Environics study that focused specifically on young people between 18 and 34. So we asked an additional 300 young people some extra questions to go with the study.
Now I want to focus a little bit on some of the specific findings and look at it critically. Did this survey ask the right questions? And the one I would say constructive criticism that I've heard is, I think there was a question in there, something about, are you more Canadian, or do you feel Canadian more, and then do you feel Muslim? So there was it was almost separated. Now, do you guys think that the comment that I've heard within the community is, why are we even asking that question? Because it's almost like, as a Muslim, then I have to pick, am I Canadian first or Muslim first, or is it both? So what's what's your take on it?
Sure. I'll begin a little bit about process first. So the process of designing the survey lasted about 3 or so months, and included about 15 people. 6 different organizations were involved in this. And it was a very rigorous process of multiple drafts of creating the sequence of the questions, the wording, making sure everyone was comfortable. That said, there was certainly the percentage of the survey had to include similar questions as was done in the 2006 study to be able to track the changes over that 10-year period. So
there was a 2006 survey that asked very similar questions.
Yeah, so for background, in 2006, the Environics Institute commissioned or produced the very first ever of its kind study of the Muslim community in Canada. And this 2016 study was intended to be an update to it. So taking some of the findings from the 06, looking at seeing what changes that have occurred in the country related to maybe current affairs or related to shifts in attitude. And so a certain percentage of the survey questions included those from the 06 study. That said, to the larger point about identity issues, I think it's a matter of, generally it's understood that identity is not binary, it's not hierarchical, it's contextual. Sometimes you're Canadian, sometimes you're Muslim, and it's largely, obviously, a very independent and individual choice. The framing, the wording of the question is one thing. I think the way in which it was reported in the media is a separate thing. So if you look back at the actual question, it wasn't so clearly, are you more Muslim or are you more Canadian? I think it's the responsibility of media outlets to be able to properly frame what the findings were. And actually in one case, CBC, one of the very first articles that they put out, and CBC was a media partner for us, with us on this study. So we gave them advanced copy of the findings, and they were able to report on it as they saw fit. And one of the earliest articles had sort of a headline that we didn't like. We responded, they changed it, so it was good. But certainly I think a lot of the initial outcry was responding to that initial headline, which was problematic, certainly.
So Shazlin, just picking up on some of the points, completely agree. I think, Mohamed, those are valid points. But do you guys think, I understand, sort of the perspective on why that question is asked, but do you think in some ways when we're asking that question, isn't it kind of feeding the mainstream narrative that already sees, in some ways, it sees Canadian Muslims as a hierarchical, like we kind of have to pick. So do you think asking that kind of a question, does it feed that same narrative?
I think you're both touching on several really important points regarding conducting this kind of study, right? So first off, there's the kind of problematic dynamic, power dynamic between the subject being studied and the wider society that's studying it. So it kind of feeds into the power dynamic between the minority and majority. So why do we feel the need to hear these numbers, right? But at the same time, like I said, we conducted a study that identified there is a large number of people in Canada who hold very racist or Islamophobic views of Muslims in Canada. So I feel it's important for those people to see these numbers. And like Mohamed said, oftentimes when these numbers are reported, there are constraints around how they can be reported or how they need to be reported within a short period of time. So that's where these problematic headlines come out. So that's why we're trying to be a bit more cautious as well in terms of what's being put out there and how those numbers are being reported and the kind of narrative that comes out from it.
Part of what I think this study hopes to accomplish is challenging some of those dominant narratives. So certainly if there is a prevailing view that Muslims are unlike other Canadians, and I sort of take the criticism that why is it our responsibility to assert our normalness, our Canadianness, and I think it is certainly a responsibility on our part to be able to challenge those dominant narratives and sort of social research like this is a way in which you can test and particularly debunk myths and stereotypes.
I'll be very honest, it is challenging being a Canadian Muslim in this day and age, but the findings of the report also noted that young Muslims are becoming more religious. How do we make sense of that?
I'm not sure I would make that conclusion based on the findings because one of the questions that they used to gauge religiosity was how frequently Muslims visit the mosque. I don't think that's a fair assessment because, from my experience as being a newcomer to Canada and a Muslim, the mosque that I frequent in my hometown, I see a lot of people there who come to the mosque and use the mosque as a community hub, as a place to find to form community and to engage with people that they have a lot of similarity with, that they don't get to do in their daily lives or
versus becoming more quote unquote religious.
Right. Yeah. So I don't think frequenting the mosque or being visibly religious is a measure of being more religious, because a lot of these things I've discovered can be also cultural, which is a beautiful thing as well.
Mohamed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my general impression is that young people are more observant of their faith than perhaps.
So you think they are becoming more observant?
I certainly think so, and I think I can speak from personal example, but certainly I think it's a means by which young people are asserting or reclaiming an identity that is sort of challenged. It's something that the Canadian society is imposing a certain definition of what a Muslim is, and it's young people challenging and sort of pushing back against that. I think part of it could certainly be that youth is a period in your life where it's a period where you're experimenting and you're rebelling, and so part of it, not certainly all of it, part of it could be a reflection of that. I also think that many Muslims, their parents came from majority Muslim countries in which Islam was the prevailing culture, and when you come to Canada and young people growing up here, this is a liberal secular democracy in which one's religious identity is something that is often you're told to keep it private, and not everyone can do that, and not everyone wants to do that. So I think I know many people who certainly look visibly Muslim, but if you were to probe deeper into their religious practices, it's more a sense of community and solidarity and identifying with that community that they feel a close affection to.
So, where do we go with these findings? And I want to preface it with another finding in the report that your organizations did, where close to 50% are feeling discriminated against, and within, I think, more than 42% are worried about the future of being targeted in some ways.
So I'll begin. I think I want to start with an anecdote. The 06 study was the first of its kind, as I mentioned earlier. Doug Saunders, the prominent Global Mail journalist, wrote a book called The Myth of the Muslim Tide. It was a best-selling book. Did a great, I think, service to the Muslim community in terms of unveiling this large group of people that there's often a lot of misinformation about. And he attributes a lot of his his statistics based on the 06 study. So I think that's something similarly, and that 06 study still continues to be cited by academics and journalists, and that's something that hopefully the 16 study will continue to do, and we might see more books and more journal articles and more, and also policy. I think that's certainly something that if you can, as you were mentioning about levels of discrimination, if you can point to spikes in, and particularly women, the ones who are most often affected by street harassment or violence, then you can create effective, good policies based on this empirical data.
Shazlin, any last words?
I think it is worrying that close to half of the young Muslims that we surveyed reported having experienced discrimination. But at the same time, I think it's important to also focus on the fact that 90% of them feel a strong sense of belonging in Canada. Over 70% of them feel proud to be Canadian, the same as their non-Muslim cohorts. So that's one of the things that I try to focus on in terms of the projects that Inspirit support. We try to focus on the agency of young Muslims, on the positive side, on their sense of hope and expectations as Muslims in Canada, rather than focusing on the problem per se. With that being said, I think it's also important to focus on the fact that young Muslims have higher expectations on how they should be treated in Canada. And it seems higher relative to their older Muslims. But it's the same level of expectations that they would have as any other young Canadians. So they expect to be able to express their religious identity. They expect to be able to practice their religion or not practice the way any other Canadians would want. So I think those are key things that we need to focus coming out of this study.
On those positive and hopeful and enlightening words, I'd like to thank you both for taking the time to come on our show.
Thanks, Aisha.
Thank you.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.